The Pacific Northwest's silent countdown, a 9.2 quake, gives just 11 minutes of warning for 4 million people with nowhere to run. That's not theory. That's not worst-case doomsday talk. That's the scenario scientists have wargamed 100 times over. That's the disaster, hiding in plain sight beneath the largest fault line off the coast of North America. A 700-mile scar in the Earth's crust that locked tight 325 years ago and is accumulating pressure so silently you'll never hear it coming. Coastal communities from Seattle to Portland to Eugene are sitting directly above the decompression zone. When the Cascadia subduction zone gives way, and it will give way because it always does, these populations will have less than 15 minutes to process the longest earthquake ever recorded on this continent, while the ground turns to liquid and the ocean resets its coastline. So what happens to 4 million people when the warning time is counted in minutes instead of hours? What choices get made? What gets left behind? And why hasn't this already changed everything about how the Pacific Northwest is built? In 2015, a journalist named Catherine Schultz published a single article in The New Yorker that shook an entire region harder than any earthquake had in 100 years. She called it the really big one. The article went viral because it wasn't theoretical. It wasn't written by academics hiding in universities. Schultz interviewed the actual scientists, the FEMA planners, the emergency managers tasked with disaster response, and they all said the same thing. A magnitude 9.0 or 9.2 earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone is not a question of if. It is only a question of when. And when it happens, the Pacific Northwest will face a catastrophe so complete that one FEMA official, Kenneth Murphy, was quoted describing the aftermath in 3 words: "Everything west of Interstate 5 will be toast." But here's where the story gets truly insane. We know with absolute certainty that this earthquake will return. We know it from the ground. We know it from the trees. We know it from across the entire Pacific Ocean in a place called Japan, where historians found records of a tsunami that arrived on January 28, 1700, without any local earthquake to trigger it. A tsunami from somewhere else. An orphan wave that Japanese scholars dated with perfect precision to January 26, 1700, at roughly 9 p.m. Pacific time. That was the last moment the Cascadia fault rupture released its energy. That was the last time the equation balanced. Now, 325 years later, pressure has been accumulating silently every single day. The geological record shows that this fault ruptures roughly every 200 to 500 years. We are well past the average. The next rupture is not coming in decades. It could come today. It could come tomorrow. The only certainty is that it is overdue. Picture this. You step outside on a normal Tuesday morning in Portland or Seattle, or any of the 4 million people living in the Pacific Northwest's major population zones. The sky is clear. There's no warning. There's no rumbling you can hear. Then, all at once, the ground doesn't shake. It rolls. It undulates. It waves like water. This is not a regular earthquake. This is the Earth fundamentally changing its shape. And this motion will last not for 10 seconds or 30 seconds. It will last for 4 to 6 minutes of continuous, intense shaking. 4 to 6 minutes of the ground moving violently enough to collapse buildings, rupture gas lines, snap bridges like kindling. And the moment it stops, the absolute second the shaking ends, you have one decision point. You are now part of a cascade that cannot be stopped. For people living inland, in Seattle, in Portland, in the Willamette Valley, the earthquake itself is the primary threat. The ground liquefaction is the killer. Liquefaction sounds like a technical term, but it's simple. During intense shaking, soil that is saturated with water loses all of its strength and begins to behave like soup. Buildings that sit on solid ground at 5:47 a.m. will be sinking into the earth by 5:53 a.m. Roads that were perfectly passable will crack and heave. Bridges will collapse. Airports will shut down. Seattle sits on enormous quantities of liquefiable soil. When the Nisqually earthquake struck in 2001, just a 6.8 magnitude, it was powerful enough to damage Boeing Field's runway so severely that the airport had to close. The Cascadia earthquake will be 400 times more powerful. Portland International Airport is built directly on liquefiable soil. The Northwest Industrial Area, where the region's fuel supply is stored, is also liquefiable. When the shaking stops, these areas will transform into islands, cut off from help, because the infrastructure that connects them will be destroyed. But here's what they didn't tell you about the coastal populations. If you live in Bandon, Newport, Seaside, or any of the small Pacific Northwest towns that hug the shoreline, towns where the ocean is closer than any high ground, your calculation is different and infinitely more desperate. Because the moment the shaking stops, you will hear a sound, an absence of sound, really. The ocean will retreat, all of it. The beach will expand to 300 yards out, maybe more. Fish will be flipping in the exposed mud. And in that moment of profound strangeness, every parent with a child is running a calculation. How fast can we get to high ground? How many minutes do we have? And the answer, according to the latest USGS models, is brutal. The first tsunami wave will arrive in roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Some models suggest 15 to 30 minutes, depending on exact location and wave speed. That is the total time window. In that window, you must recognize that an earthquake has just happened. You must decide to evacuate. You must move through a population that may be panicked, injured, confused. You must reach ground that is higher than everything that will follow. The study is specific about what happens next. Of the roughly 94,870 people living in tsunami hazard zones across Northern California, Oregon, and Washington state, about 21,500 would not have time to reach higher ground if they walked slowly. That drops to 16,000 if they walked quickly. Walked. As if walking is even possible. As if every street isn't cracked. As if there's a clear path. As if people aren't searching for family members. As if parents aren't carrying children. The problem is so acute that state emergency planners have calculated they need between 55 and 85 vertical evacuation structures, towers, artificial hills, safe havens, built along the Washington coast alone just to save lives. Newport, Oregon, is literally building what they call Safe Haven Hill, a 100-foot-tall forested mound with lighted walkways so that people can find their way up in the dark. That is the infrastructure of controlled retreat. That is what the government is finally building because it accepted that you cannot outrun the water. If you live in Portland or Seattle, the death toll will come later. FEMA has run the numbers with brutal precision. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone will kill an estimated 14,000 people in Oregon and Washington alone. Another 27,000 will be injured. Those are the people who die in the first 24 hours, from collapsed buildings, from fires that ignite in thousands of locations simultaneously because gas lines are ruptured across the entire region, from drowning when the rivers that flow through these cities back up with debris and tsunami water. But the actual catastrophe is in the aftermath. FEMA projects that 1 million people will be displaced. Another 2.5 million will require food and water. The entire regional infrastructure, electrical grids, water treatment, hospitals, roads, the systems that allow modern life to exist, will be functionally offline. This is not regional disruption. This is not a crisis that other parts of America can stabilize in weeks. This is economic collapse at a scale where total damage estimates reach $32 to $50 billion. If that blew your mind, every subscriber is automatically entered in our monthly giveaway for a branded hoodie. Details are in the description. Because here's what actually keeps emergency planners awake at night. It's not the earthquake. It's not the tsunami. It's what comes after you survive. It's the isolation. When liquefaction breaks roads and collapses bridges, entire communities become inaccessible. Relief supplies can't get in. Injured people can't get out. The National Guard can't reach civilian populations. Hospitals that weren't destroyed in the initial shaking will be overwhelmed with patients they cannot treat because there is no power, no water, no supply chain delivering medications, or blood, or antibiotics. The nearest National Guard base that could provide assistance? Most are 300 miles away. Could be more, depending on deployment status. How do you transport food and medicine to stranded communities when the bridges are down, when the ports are destroyed, when the entire Pacific coast is simultaneously dealing with the same collapse? The answer is you can't. Not immediately, not for weeks, maybe not for months in some locations. Now let's talk about what most people don't understand about warning systems. There is a technology called Shake Alert. It's designed to detect earthquakes in real time and send warnings to people before the shaking reaches them. Sounds perfect, right? Sounds like salvation. But here's the catch that most people miss. Shake Alert works by detecting the fast-moving pressure waves, called P waves, that travel ahead of the destructive shaking. The system measures these waves, calculates the earthquake's location and magnitude, and then broadcasts a warning. The whole process takes about 4 to 20 seconds, depending on how close you are to the epicenter and how dense the monitoring network is around you. 4 to 20 seconds. For a coast where the tsunami arrives in 10 to 15 minutes, that sounds fine, but it isn't, because Shake Alert has a dead zone. Close to the epicenter, the area experiencing the most violent shaking, there is no warning time at all. The P waves and the destructive S waves reach you simultaneously. You get the alert after the shaking has already begun. You are already running, already panicking, already trying to make decisions while the earth is moving beneath your feet. The Cascadia subduction zone is offshore. The epicenter is roughly 60 to 100 miles away from the coast. That distance is actually enough for Shake Alert to function. People in Portland, people in Seattle, people inland might get 20 to 30 seconds of warning before the intense shaking arrives. 30 seconds. Long enough to get out of a building if you're already thinking about it. Long enough to move away from windows if you're paying attention. Long enough to realize something catastrophic is happening. But for the coastal communities, the smaller towns, the fishing villages, the places where people live because they want to be near the ocean, the warning is different. They will feel the shaking first. The ocean retreat will be their only warning that a tsunami is coming. And by then, the clock is already running. By then, every second is a choice between staying and running. Between trying to grab a photo or a memory and getting to high ground. Between waiting for family members and abandoning them. The geological evidence tells us something else. The last Cascadia earthquake in 1700 was recorded in Japan because the tsunami crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and hit the Japanese coast with waves that were 3 to 5 meters high, roughly 10 to 16 feet. Those waves traveled across an empty ocean. They didn't hit any barrier reefs. They didn't interact with shipping channels or harbors. They just marched across the world's largest ocean for 10 hours and still arrived with enough power to destroy boats and damage coastal structures. Now imagine that same tsunami, born from the same fault, but this time it hits a coast that is covered with ports, with fishing vessels, with marinas, with houses built right at sea level. That tsunami will not diminish. It will amplify as it hits the continental shelf. The wave height will increase. The damage will be orders of magnitude worse. And because the Pacific Northwest coast is heavily developed with commercial infrastructure, the economic damage will be staggering. The fishing industry alone generates billions of dollars for the region annually. One tsunami wipes that clean. Ports destroyed. Docks destroyed. the aquaculture farms that line the coast, all of it gone. The scientific certainty that makes this scenario real is that the Cascadia subduction zone will rupture again. That certainty is written in the stone. The recurrence interval is roughly 200 to 500 years. We are at 325. The seismic stress accumulated on that fault is unprecedented in the recorded history of North American monitoring. Every day, every single day, those two plates push against each other with more force. The Juan de Fuca plate is sliding beneath the North American plate at a rate of roughly 1.5 inches per year. That doesn't sound like much until you multiply it across years and decades and centuries. Across 3 centuries, that's 450 inches. That's 37.5 feet. 37.5 feet of locked plates trying to move but held in place by friction. When friction fails, that energy has to go somewhere. It goes into motion. It goes into the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded by human civilization. When the Tohoku earthquake struck Japan in 2011, it was magnitude 9.0. The shaking lasted for minutes. The tsunami that followed killed more than 18,000 people. That same magnitude event is waiting offshore from the Pacific Northwest. The only difference is that the Cascadia tsunami will strike a region that is far more densely populated, far more dependent on interconnected infrastructure, far more vulnerable to cascading systemic collapse. Here's what most people don't realize about the scale of this fault. 700 miles. That is the length of the Cascadia subduction zone. 700 miles of locked fault line running from northern Vancouver Island all the way down to Cape Mendocino in Northern California. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the distance from Chicago to New York City. Imagine a fault line that long, that powerful, releasing all of its energy in a sequence of shakes. The Juan de Fuca plate is subducting, pushing down beneath the North American plate at a relatively shallow angle. That geometry is what creates megathrust earthquakes. When the rupture propagates, it doesn't just happen in one spot. It cascades. It breaks all the way along the fault in a sequence of violent motions that can last for 5 minutes or more. This is not a quick jolt. This is the Earth fundamentally reorganizing its internal structure. The Pacific Northwest coast will literally shift position. Some areas will rise. Some areas will sink. The coastline will be redrawn by geology rather than politics or human planning. The subsidence, the sinking, is particularly dangerous in places like coastal Oregon. Some areas will subside by 6 feet or more. 6 feet. Think about what that means for a coastal town that sits near sea level. If the land sinks 6 feet and the sea level rises with the tsunami, you're looking at water levels that are 10 to 12 feet higher than they were moments before. Houses that were on dry land are now submerged. The first floor of every building near the coast is underwater. The escape routes are cut off by water. People who thought they had time to evacuate are suddenly trapped. This is not speculation. This happened in Japan in 2011. The Tohoku earthquake caused massive subsidence in some coastal areas. Combined with the tsunami, it created flooding that persisted for months in some locations. The Pacific Northwest will experience the same phenomenon on an even larger scale. And here's the part that no one really wants to talk about. The Cascadia Fault is not the only major rupture zone in the Pacific Northwest. Directly beneath Seattle runs another fault line called the Tacoma Fault. It is capable of producing earthquakes up to magnitude 7.3, not a 9.0, but easily sufficient to destroy buildings, kill people, and complicate the response to the larger Cascadia event happening simultaneously offshore. It is possible, maybe probable, that when the Cascadia rupture releases 325 years of accumulated stress, it will also trigger secondary ruptures on other faults across the entire region. That means the destruction will not be localized. It will be distributed. It will be everywhere at once. It will overwhelm every resource, every responder, every coordination system simultaneously. FEMA has simulated this scenario in multiple Cascadia rising exercises, wargaming the exact logistics of response. Spoiler alert, they run out of supplies before they make real progress in most scenarios. They cannot move resources fast enough. They cannot coordinate between regions because the communication infrastructure is destroyed. They have to make impossible choices about who gets help first. Think about that phrase, impossible choices, because that's what we're actually talking about. When the Cascadia earthquake strikes, emergency management officials will have to decide which communities get immediate help, which hospitals get generator fuel, which neighborhoods get food and water first, which regions are abandoned to fend for themselves while resources are concentrated where they might save the most lives. These are not theoretical discussions anymore. After the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, emergency managers had to make these exact choices. They had to decide which evacuation centers got supplies, which shelters would be supported, and which would be left to rely on whatever local resources they could scrape together. And that was in a country with a functioning national government, modern infrastructure, and the ability to mobilize military resources across the entire nation. The Pacific Northwest is not Japan. The federal response will take time. The first responders will be local. They will be overwhelmed. The real number that keeps FEMA up at night is the displacement figure: 1 million people. Imagine 1 million people needing to relocate because their homes are destroyed, their communities are inaccessible, their lives as they knew them no longer exist. That is not a number. That is a catastrophe that defies comprehension. Where do 1 million people go? What cities have 1 million spare houses? What regions have the infrastructure to absorb that many displaced people? The answer is nowhere. There is nowhere in America that can absorb 1 million displaced people from a single event. They will spread across the country. Families will scatter. Communities will be permanently broken. The cultural identity of the Pacific Northwest will be altered forever. And this is not speculation. This is what disaster recovery experts have calculated based on damage assessments, population distribution, and available housing stock. The Cascadia earthquake is not an event that the region can recover from in a decade. It is an event that will reshape America's West Coast for generations. The thing about this particular disaster is that you cannot wait it out. You cannot shelter in place for a hurricane. You cannot drive north for a week and let a flood recede. The cascading effects of a Cascadia earthquake will be permanent and immediate. If you live in Portland or Seattle, your building might survive the shaking, but your electrical grid will not. Your water treatment plant will not. The food supply that arrived by truck yesterday will not be replaced for weeks. If you live on the coast, your entire town might be inundated. The homes, the businesses, the fishing industry, the tourism economy, all of it will be erased and reset by salt water and sand. And then there is the radioactive elephant in the room. The Diablo Canyon nuclear plant in California sits in a seismic zone. The Columbia Generating Station in Washington State sits in a region that will definitely experience intense shaking. Neither is designed to withstand a magnitude 9.0 earthquake. Both sit at sea level, where tsunami surge is a secondary threat. If either facility fails in ways that release radiation, then the scope of the disaster expands geometrically. What makes the Cascadia scenario particularly terrifying is that it cannot be stopped or slowed by any technology we possess. You cannot prevent an earthquake. You cannot weaken a fault line. You cannot negotiate with geology. The best humanity can do is adapt, build differently, plan better, create systems that survive the initial impact and facilitate response in the aftermath. And the Pacific Northwest has done some of this. Building codes have been upgraded. Emergency plans have been drafted. Evacuation routes have been identified. But there is a gap between planning and execution, between theoretical preparation and actual response under the worst conditions imaginable. When the earthquake strikes and the power goes out, will the emergency communication systems work? When roads are blocked by liquefaction and landslides, will relief supplies find their way in? When hospitals are damaged and running on backup generators, will they have enough fuel for weeks of operation? These are not rhetorical questions. These are the actual bottlenecks that emergency managers have identified, and many of them have no good solutions. The Pacific Northwest has not experienced a major earthquake in living memory. The 2001 Nisqually earthquake was only magnitude 6.8. It caused damage, but it was survivable. It was recoverable. It taught some lessons. It revealed some vulnerabilities. But it was not the really big one. Nobody in the region has personal experience with a magnitude 9.0 earthquake. Nobody alive has seen a tsunami from the Cascadia subduction zone. Nobody has lived through the months and years of recovery that would follow. That absence of historical experience is dangerous. It creates a false sense of security. It creates a belief that somehow the catastrophe will not be as bad as the science suggests. That somehow people will adapt. Somehow communities will survive. Somehow it will be manageable. But the science is clear. The projections are clear. The only variable is timing. The real silent countdown is not the 11 minutes that coastal residents will have before tsunami arrival. It's the days and weeks and months of silence before the next rupture actually begins. Right now, tonight, tomorrow, 325 years of continuous stress is being added grain by grain to a fault that already feels maximum pressure. The Cascadia subduction zone is literally locked in a vise, plates trying to move but held in place. And that vise is being tightened infinitesimally every single day. Scientists cannot tell you which day the lock will break. They cannot tell you which hour. They can only tell you with geological certainty that it will break. They can only tell you that when it does, 4 million people will have minutes to respond to a disaster that will reshape the Pacific Northwest for a generation. The question is not whether the Pacific Northwest is ready for the really big one. The question is whether the Pacific Northwest can ever be ready for something this large, this fast, this inevitable. And if stories like this remind you that the unexpected can arrive without warning, grab your free disaster preparedness toolkit. The link is in the description. Because the only time to prepare for a disaster is before it arrives. The only time to create family emergency plans, to check your supplies, to understand evacuation routes for your specific location, is in the silence before, while the fault is still locked, while the countdown is still running, while you still have the luxury of preparedness and choice.